to give you an update on what's going on at the Judson Meade Geologic Field Station in Montana, which is the Indiana University field station that probably all of you know very, very well. We have traditionally over the years had face-to-face meetings to update alumni in places like Houston or Denver. But given the current situation, that's really not practical. And so we're doing a virtual update. And really it works a lot better because we can have alumni from all over the country or all over the world attend instead of just the ones in the local areas where we hold the face-to-face meetings. I do want to say one thing though, that I hope everybody, it's Friday evening, I hope everybody brought your own beverage. I picked a very appropriate beverage, which is an IPA from MAP Brewing in Bozeman, Montana. So only about 50 miles away from the field station. And if you've never had a can of MAP Brewing beer, you should get one at least because they have topographic maps on the beer cans. So it's in Southwest Montana and they have topographic maps on the beer cans. So with that, Paige, can you give me the first slide?
Of course, Jim. Let me give that.
So again, I want to thank you for joining us for this virtual update. And we felt it was important to do this because 2020 has been a very unusual year for everybody. But the field station faculty and staff really had to jump through some interesting hoops because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So next slide, Paige. Page, oh, there we go, thanks. So on March 15th, IU announced that they were canceling face-to-face classes for the rest of the spring semester. We immediately started discussions with the administration about the field station courses in the summer. And on March 30th, they informed us that we would not be allowed to teach face-to-face at the field station. At that time, we had about 65 students signed up for the face-to-face courses. We sent out a letter, gave them the option to defer to 2021 or take a virtual course. 42 of them elected to defer to 2021 and 19 of them elected to take the virtual course. So 2 weeks later, we had the preliminary design of the virtual course outlined. And then a month after that, myself and Cass Stegner and Will Kersey, two of our associate instructors, started building the field modules. About 10 days after we started building the field modules, Paige Quentin and Mike Regal started assembling those modules and adding other content in to actually build the course material that the students would use. On June 22nd, we closed the admissions to the course. We had 39 students enrolled. And Bruce Douglas and Sarah George and 4 associate instructors started testing the modules to get ready for the first day of the class, which was June 29th. So we did a lot very quickly, and we think we delivered something that was very high quality and worthy of the Judson Meade Geologic Field Station reputation. Next slide, Paige. So tonight's agenda, you have to listen to me for this first few minutes, and then Paige Quentin is going to talk about the course that we built, this virtual course to replace 429. Paige has been faculty for 429 and of course this year for 5 years. She has a PhD from University of Missouri, and she joined us when she graduated from Missouri and moved to Potsdam to join the faculty with Mike Regal. Paige is going to be followed by Sarah George. Dr. Sarah George was a student in 429. She came back as an AI in 429. She came back once as faculty in the face-to-face course, and then she acted as faculty again for us this year in the virtual course. Sarah will be followed by Maddie Lewis. Maddie was one of our associate instructors. I've already mentioned Cass and Will. In addition to Maddie, we had Emily Thorpe, Olivia Mole, and darn it, I'm having a senior moment. Paige, help me.
That was it. Eli quit, or Eli took a job.
Oh, okay.
Right?
No,
And Will, you got Will.
I got Will. Okay, so maybe I'm not having a senior.
Will also participated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, so back to Maddie. So Maddie was a student at IU and in 429, and she's now at Caltech finishing her PhD, and she had contacted us and wanted to be an associate instructor for this past summer's face-to-face course. And when we had to switch to a virtual course, she very graciously and quickly said she was in for that too. So she'll talk to us about some of the challenges of teaching in a virtual environment. Bruce Douglas, who many of you know, maybe all of you know, has taught 429 for I think 35 years now, Bruce. And he's going to give you a very quick overview of the difference between mapping in the field and having to map virtually with the technologies that we have available to us today. Mike Riegel, who has taught 429 for 10 or 11 years now, will wrap up and talk about the lessons we learned. And this is really about how do we take things we learned this summer to make all of the courses, virtual and face-to-face, better in the future. And then after Mike finishes, I'll come back and talk to you about what we did at the field station, taking advantage of the fact that we didn't have any students to get in the way while we were working this summer. And then finally, the last part of this evening is a Q&A, where you can ask any of us questions. We ask that you submit your questions through the Q&A button on the Zoom window. It may be in different places on different people's Zoom windows. For me, it's just to the right of center at the bottom of my Zoom window, but yours may be someplace else. It says Q&A. If you'll submit your questions there, Barb will try to group questions that are similar together, and then she'll try and point questions at the appropriate faculty at the or associate instructors at the right time. With that, I'll turn the evening's entertainment over to Paige, and she has a lot of good stuff to tell you.
Hey everyone. So I'm going to talk about how the course kind of came together and how it came together in terms of the actual materials and also the web interface. So I'm going to be going in between the actual course page. You guys actually get to go in and see the course page that the students were interacting with and this PowerPoint. So bear with me as I do that. And my PowerPoint's frozen. Okay, so first I want to talk a little bit about our general philosophy and approach to the course. A couple of things when we got started is that we really wanted the course to, because it was going to be on a virtual format or in online, we want it to be an interactive experience so that it was more like browsing through a web page than it was like just downloading some files and completing assignments. So we wanted it as much as possible to be kind of the learning experience taking place in the actual platform. One of the things that we really thought about, and we do this in the normal field course, but allowed us to kind of, because we were redesigning everything, think through what skills were important and how we scaffolded those skills throughout the course so that we were bringing everyone up to speed in the beginning and then kind of reintroducing or getting students to apply those skills in different settings as they move throughout the course. This was Jim's really big thing, is that he wanted to make sure these students signed up for a field course, and he wanted them to have the experience of a field course. Because frankly, some of this stuff we could get them to do things like making maps and doing cross sections on exercises that didn't involve any field videos. But this is supposed to be a field course, and so we wanted to make sure that they got to see what it was like out there. And so Jim and the AIs did a great job going out there and getting the videos, getting photographs, and allowing the students to really feel like they were, as much as possible, out in Montana. And then the last thing is, and I won't touch on this too much, but building community. That's a big part of field camp. And so we were trying, as we built the course and designed it, to figure out ways to make sure that we were trying to build a sense of community. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each week and kind of talk about general things that we did and how those were achieving these general philosophies and approaches. So in week one, just like in the normal field course, the job was to bring everyone up to speed. We have students coming from all kinds of backgrounds, some of them seniors, some of them even graduate students, some of them only having things like structural geology, not having ever had a paleo class, or not having had a SED class, or some of them not having a structure class. And so the job was to bring them all up to speed to make sure that they had that fundamental knowledge base and skills base to be able to then do the more complicated geologic problems that we were going to ask them to do. The other thing is that we had to teach them how to use all the tools that we would use throughout the rest of the course. Now, normally this is, how do you use a button? How do you, Jim says I shouldn't say drop acid, but how do you, do acid tests? How do you do a hammer, a hardness test? And so that's normally what we're teaching them how to do in the caravan. But now we had to teach them how to use Google Earth, how to use a button without actually being there with them, how to read strike and dip symbols, how to use the interface, the learning platform that IU has in place. And so it was a very different tool set that we were trying to implement in this virtual version of the course. We wanted to use a combination of web-based quizzes where they were interacting with the web interface, but also some turn-in assignments that were paper-based, because there's some things that you can't just write, aren't really easy to do in the online format yet. So things like their first time making a cross-section, we wanted that to be paper because there's nothing really like doing it by hand. Doing the stereo nets the first time with paper. Those were important things that we kept in place, and students were able to kind of take pictures of their work and upload it so that we would grade that paper work. So let's actually go into the interface and see what this looks like. So IU's interface, their learning platform is Canvas. And this is the Canvas website for the virtual course. And what we were able to do is organize everything in what is called a module format, so that each week is a series of skills or a kind of similar assignments that they're going to complete. And you'll see that if you walk through the course, each week is a separate module. And so in the first week, we have a series of basic skills and tools that they were going to work with. And some examples of what this looks like. For example, if I go to the folds module, the folds module is just there to make sure everyone understands what the different types of folds are and how to identify them and put proper symbols on them. And so one of the things I was really proud of is, one, this is what I mean when I say that it's all in an online format, like the introduction, which is short here, lecture videos, and then assignments are all available on one page, and they complete the whole thing through this one page. But what I was probably most proud of in these kind of intro, kind of bringing everyone up to speed modules were the way that we were able to do lectures. And so I'm just going to start playing this video here, and you can kind of watch it as it goes. we wanted to make the teaching as much like it would have been in the classroom at the field station, and where we're writing on the board and we're sketching things. That's a really good way to learn. That's really hard to translate when you go into this virtual format. Luckily, we had some tablets with pens that we were able to actually draw as we were interacting with students, or in recorded lectures like this, features and walk them through how to identify, in this case, a fold in map view. And so those lectures were things that the students could watch multiple times. And then once they watched the lecture, they then had to take a content quiz. And so this is an example of what one of those quizzes looked like. And these are all just, for some students, they were really easy. They went right through them. For some, they hadn't had a structure class. So they kind of, this was their first time dealing with some of this stuff. And so these quizzes were getting them to look at actual Google Earth images, where they're seeing the types of structures that they're going to see eventually when they start mapping, and familiarizing themselves with what these things look like. And so we're not only quizzing them on how to identify different types of folds, but what to start to think about when they're looking at the Google Earth images. And so a variety of images from places all around the world, where now we can actually take them to some of the classic places to identify some of this stuff. And even went so far as being able to start to draw symbols on a Google Earth image. In this case, there are symbols that are drawn incorrectly, and they have to figure out that they are in fact drawn incorrectly. So that's the kind of content quizzes that we were doing in that first week. The other thing we were doing, as I mentioned, is teaching the students some skills. And so here's a block on Google Earth, how to use it and what kinds of things you can do. And so, we have these instructional videos. In this case, Mike Riegel was giving the lecture, but where we're, walking them through us using Google Earth to do a variety of things. In this case, I think he was doing distances using a ruler function in Google Earth. So, it's a really powerful way that we could pre-record lectures where we're actually interacting with the stuff that the students will eventually be interacting with. Okay, so that's kind of what week one looked like. In week two, we went with okay, now they know the basic skills, let's get them familiar with the regional geologic history. And this is really important because that understanding and putting the mapping projects into the regional geologic history becomes an important step as they move through the course. And a lot of times, many of our students don't necessarily have things like even a historical geology class. So they're really lacking in that understanding of the geologic history. And so on the caravan in the field course, that's usually where we give them this history. Now we have to do it without being out in the world, but we have some benefits here I think are really helpful. And that is one, that we can use this as an opportunity to take the skills that we learned the first week and start applying them in situations where they're not only, getting better at those skills, but now learning the geologic history in that context. And the big thing is that we're able to get them to actually look at geologic maps and get familiar with what they look like before they actually have to build them themselves. And I think Mike's will talk a little bit more about how beneficial this step was. But what I want to show you is kind of what that looked like in practice. Okay, so that week was divided into time intervals, with the first time interval for that week being the Precambrian geology. And so what we did here is we have a summary that gets the students started, what to expect. We have a series of lecture videos on igneous and metamorphic rocks. So reintroducing some of those skills that they learned in the first week, like how to identify them, and then starting to think about what they mean in terms of the geologic history. And we had some great other faculty members that contributed some great lectures here. And then lectures on general geologic history. Jim helped us out and gave us some of these lectures as well. And then what they were doing for each of these kind of time slices is actually looking at a published geologic map. And here's an example of the Mount Rushmore quad that they were using for the Precambrian geology section. And they're actually looking at the map, and they have a series of questions where, in this case, they're looking at the age of metamorphism associated with isograds relative to faulting. Or they're asked questions like, what are the protoliths of the metamorphic rocks here? They're basically asked questions like, what are the cross-cutting relationships and things like that? And then they're supposed to start to infer a geologic timeline from those things. So they have a map, and all of these questions are associated with a quiz in the online format. So they complete a quiz on the Black Hills. And then what I really liked is at the end, they get all the right answers at the end. What are the general things that they're seeing there? But then they're asked to write a synthesis, taking their observations and interpreting them. In this case, we asked them to walk through a complete history of the Precambrian geology of the Black Hills and give them some things that they should talk about. And so they're doing this thing where they're familiarizing themselves with geologic maps. They're making basic observations, getting those checked. And then once they have those basic observations, they're putting together a geologic timeline and then putting it into the context that they've learned from watching the lectures for that week. And so that's how we did the regional geology section of the course. So they had a week, they walked through time and did maps and other similar exercises to learn the regional geology. Okay. In week 3 and 4, this was the time when they were really asked to solidify their skills from the first couple of weeks. And the big thing is, this is when they start mapping. And so they're learning how to map here. And now that they've learned how to, well, they're learning how to map, they've dealt with geologic maps that have already been produced, and from those started to produce a geologic history. Now, what they're going to need to do is take the maps that they produce and use their observations to construct a geologic history of the map area. So looking at what structures they identify and what those cross-cutting relationships of those various structures means for the geologic timeline of their map area. And so I'm going to dive in to the Highway 2 mapping project and how that came together. So first thing is, each day was, usually we have a traverse a day out at the field camp. And so we tried to keep that theme alive where it was traverse 1, traverse 2 for each day. And the first thing is that the students were given a Google Earth file right here. And on that Google Earth file, they have a base map that they have a paper version of that is overlaying the satellite image from Google Earth. And so each of these points here is a point on their first traverse. And so they're starting here at 4.3.1, and then they're walking through a traverse that ends with them at this last point here. And so this is, if you've done Highway 2, this is the first day's traverse. And so those points actually correspond to points in our web interface traverse. And so what the students are given is that they have that Google Earth file with all the traverse points. They're given, this is the area that you're going to be mapping today and should have complete by the end of this traverse. And then they walk through the traverse with points indicated that then have a field video in most cases, which Jim and the other AIs filmed, photos, in some cases, hand lens images, strike and dip information, and some basic field notes. And so what they do is they walk through, and interspersed in these observations that they're making at each field location, they have traverse quizzes. And those quizzes are there because in the field, we usually touch base with the students, and we use these basically as teaching points. And we also use it as an opportunity to make sure that students are on track. And so those quizzes are built in here to make sure that they're coming up with multiple working hypotheses, and that they understand what's going on. So an example of one of those quizzes, it would be here at near the end of that first day's traverse, where they're thinking through, I'm at this station and I make this observation. What would I expect to see as I move forward and continue on my traverse? And I think this was a very successful way of implementing what I think is one of the biggest good teaching parts of our field camp, is this kind of making multiple working hypotheses and testing those hypotheses as you're walking through the map area. And so these quizzes were interspersed throughout the mapping exercises. Some of these things are pretty complex when they're on the J-fold. Usually we're out there and faculty members at different intervals within that J-fold. And now, we're going to have to, point them in the right direction without necessarily being there and standing in there and saying, hey, do you get this? And so these quizzes really help with this, because at the end, they got the right answers. But they were still, those who knew what they were doing got 100s on these quizzes. Those who didn't learned from their mistakes, but went forward with correct understanding. And of course, as always, our last traverse, we tried to keep alive some of the feelings that students have on these traverses. And this was my thing at the end of the last traverse, when they go up Mystery Hill and they go into the pit of despair. I don't know if that's what we call them now. I think Bruce disagrees and calls it the bowl of enlightenment, but many of the students call it the pit of despair. And so just to kind of keep that kind of feeling alive, we tried to add these things to the traverses in the web interface to kind of make them still feel like you're experiencing these things in the same way that the students in the field would actually do it. So that's a typical mapping exercise, and I'd be happy to show more detail. I'm just trying to make sure I get through everything. So that gets me through examples of the mapping. And then week 5 was the final project. And the final project has always been about increasing their independence, thinking about decision-making and time management. And we wanted to come up with a way to do that in the virtual format. The other thing is that we wanted to increase the complexity. We wanted a bigger area and more complex structures for the students to really test their knowledge. And so the last thing is that an important part of the course has become at the end to take their observations and their interpretation and present them in a journal style manuscript. So the end result is a map, a cross section, and a paper or report where they talk through, they do an introduction, they do a method section, a regional geologic history, they do results, and then an interpretation and conclusion. They even write an abstract usually. And so that's an important part of this final mapping project. And it's something we build up to through the course by having them do those smaller synthesis essays as we went. So quickly, since I'm running out of time, the final study area, we did Sandy Hollow. And Jim had great fun out there filming these videos. I have only been to a couple of areas in Sandy Hollow, but now very much want to go explore it more. And the way that we did Sandy Hollow to kind of capture that more independence, decision-making, and time management was, instead of doing a traverse, we had the stations, every single station that Jim visited, and there were lots of them, organized in a table. And those stations each had videos associated with them, field sketches, observations, and then we ranked them in priority level. And we did that because we wanted to make sure that every student visited certain stations, but then after that, they were allowed to make decisions about what stations they were going to visit. And part of that was how complex it ended up getting, or how much time they had and were capable of actually visiting every station versus getting the time to work more on their cross sections. And so this was the best way that we could think of how to implement that kind of decision-making process into the mapping exercise. Of course, we still had some quizzes breaking up these stations. That was, again, there just to make sure that some students didn't get completely off track and were thinking about the right things. In a lot of cases, we were able to put instructional videos and things like that inside of those quizzes so that students could make sure that they were on the right track. But they walked through a series of days where they had to make decisions about what stations they visited, and then they completed their map cross section and then the final report. Okay, so that is the basic format of the course. And I know that was very quick. I just gave this talk at GSA and I had to do it in 12 minutes. So I think I went over that here. But I'm more than willing to explore the Canvas interface in the question and answer session if you guys are interested to explore that more. At this point, I'm going to hand it over to Sarah George to talk about building community.
Yeah, hi everyone. So I'm a postdoc at University of Arizona currently. And as Jim mentioned, I've been involved with this course for a long time. And I think one of the things that strikes all of us about being involved with IUGFS is it's not just the experience of going to the field and learning the geology. It's also kind of this community building event, right? And so how do you take something that is fundamentally about being around other people and learning from other people and learning these skill sets from people and put it online? And, you know, I think the fact that we've had over 100 participants tune into this session tonight is just a testament to this really strong community that we have. So Paige, can you go to the next slide? So, you know, we have a lot of interactions both in the lodge, back at camp, and out in the field. And so trying to come up with a way to recreate this online was really, really challenging. Paige, next slide. And so what we came up with was admittedly imperfect, but we've used this app called Slack, and this messaging system is compatible on all sorts of devices. And basically what it lets you do is have a series of discussion pages where anyone can post and you can have back and forth. So we had both kind of, you know, academic discussion pages where people asked questions about the coursework itself, and they were able to get really quick answers, which I think helped with kind of engagement between staff and students. But we also had, you know, kind of fun, silly discussions about you know, mountain goats in the videos. And a lot of the students use this one Slack group called Random, where they kind of, you know, created a virtual community, and they had lots of online discussions that spurred from that. So that's kind of cool. The other thing we did is we had every afternoon, we would have an afternoon session where students could come drop by and ask any questions that they might have. It's kind of like a virtual office hours, and we would have breakout sessions with the TAs. So an imperfect version of community, but our best attempt at an online version. And I think, you know, a lot of the students in kind of their feedback for the course indicated that Slack was a really powerful way for them to stay, you know, somewhat involved in the virtual format. So I'll pass it on. Thank you guys for having me.
Hi everyone, I'm Maddie Lewis. I was in AI this summer, and my job, along with my other co-AIs, were mainly interacting with students in addition to grading. So here I have a list of many of the opportunities for interacting with students that we had in this course. We had multiple Zoom lectures per day, or a lecture in the morning and a kind of Q&A session that Sarah mentioned in the afternoon. We also had Slack, and through Slack, students could ask us one-on-one questions of the group, or they could request a one-on-one type Zoom meeting. So all of those interactions we think are rather comparable to something that they would get at the field station, either through a lecture type presentation or through being able to ask us questions. And then in addition, we had some review sessions that I'll talk a bit about more in detail. and some feedback on Canvas that we were able to give when students had assignments due or partial assignments due midweek. We were able to give them some feedback so they could improve that for the final turn-in. And as Sarah mentioned, we had some interaction between students on Slack, which, if imperfect, was the best that we could do this year. Next slide, please. Okay, so here I'll go a little bit more detail into these review sessions, which the AIs kind of spearheaded this year. We noticed that students were struggling with some specific topics which maybe they hadn't experienced before in previous courses. And so we picked the topics for review sessions based on student need and tried to schedule the sessions such that if students had daytime obligations, if they were working during this course, then they could attend these after work. And we really tried to make these interactive. We mainly used the annotation feature in Zoom, which was very, very helpful in getting students to engage. We noticed in a lot of our meetings that students were hesitant to ask questions, nervous asking something in front of a group of people online that you've really never met. So this annotation feature was very helpful because they're basically drawing on whoever's shared screen anonymously. So they can draw in whatever color they pick. They don't have to tell us who is responding, and they can just throw up whatever their ideas are. And that really led to some great practice assignments and just ability to engage with the students. And then those sessions were recorded and posted on Canvas for any other students who maybe couldn't attend at the time of the session. Some improvements, if we do continue these in future years, would be to schedule assignments or schedule sessions at the beginning of the course so that students can plan for them, and then anticipate which topics might be difficult, again, so that students just know what might be coming and what they can try to do with that. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's an example of one of the review sessions. On the left, you see what Bruce nicely gave us this cross-section profile with some contacts marked on it. And then on the right is our completed cross-section that the students were able to help construct. So basically, I shared my screen for the whole session with this profile, and the students were able to sketch in using Zoom what they thought was going on, and then I could solidify those lines as they told me which ones were finalized. And through these review sessions, this is just one example, but we did see improvements in student work compared to previous weeks. So we think this was quite a successful idea. Next slide, please. And lastly, for what I'll be talking about, we did get a little bit of student feedback during the course, and afterwards we ran 2 surveys, one after the second week and one after week 5, so at the end of the course. And this is just a quick summary. This is not all of the questions that we asked them, but on the left, you can see the number of hours that students reported spending either in Zoom meetings, in watching the lecture videos, or just doing their assignments during the day. And we think this is reasonably comparable to what they would spend in the field, of course, minus hiking time between stops, because they can just immediately fly to the next spot in Google Earth. In the middle, we can see that us as instructors improved throughout the course as well. This one is their answers to how clear was our feedback on your assignments. And you can see that in the second survey, many more students responded that our feedback was very clear as compared to the first survey. And on the right is another comparison between the first and last survey, which really shows the difference between before we implemented the review sessions and some midweek feedback type assignments, that many more students responded that they were receiving enough help on assignments. And students, we think part of this is because students were simply just more comfortable asking questions after they got a little more experience with the virtual setting. So that was all quite successful, and I'll pass it off to Bruce now.
Okay, thank you. What it's been said that I have been involved for many years in this course, and what we've chosen to do is highlight one of the mapping exercises that Paige went through in a little more detail earlier on, and that's the Highway 2 area. And those of you that know me, those of you that know me know that this is my favorite area in all of Southwest Montana because of the style of folding that's present there. And what I wanted to do was contrast the kinds of maps that were produced by students in the traditional field courses with those that were produced in the virtual course. And Paige has done a very nice job talking about all the things we did to try to scaffold the students to be able to do this kind of exercise without being actually in the field. And so if I could have the next slide, please. So this is a map on an air photo from one of our traditional courses from a number of years ago. And you could see the details that have been recorded by this student that nicely reflect the geometry and label the various fold axes as the student was able to determine these from doing the field work. And one of the big differences, which I need to point out, is that when the students are in a traditional field course, they're having to make decisions, literally figuring out where they're going to hike, what they're going to observe and make observations on. And that's one of the things that was different with the virtual field course, because they were given locations and virtual images of the various outcrops. So that's something to keep in mind as we're looking at these images. Oops, if I could have the next slide, please. So this is a map. And then the next slide is the cross section. And you could see the geometry here nicely reflects the sort of angular nature of these fault bend folds that are being developed and some of the minor structures that are being recorded. And the student was recording nicely what was going on in terms of the geometries as they were looking at things. Next slide, please. This is the equivalent map produced by one of the students in the virtual course. And I am very pleased to say that this student did a remarkably good job of mapping the structure that's there at Highway 2. So they were able to identify that there was both an upright and an overturned limb. They didn't get that quite right, but that's okay. And they had some of the details of the folding of the fault and other details. So in general, this particular student did a very nice job of picking up the geology that was located in the Highway 2 area. Next slide, please. The big difference is, you may recall the cross section that I showed you for the student that had been working in the regular class. Notice that this cross section does not look anything like the one that I just showed you, and it doesn't look much like the actual geology on the ground. A lot of these folds are shown with curved fold axes rather than angular. There's not enough detail shown at depth or in the projection, but it is a good first attempt at making a cross section showing the complexity of the geology in the Highway 2 area. Next slide, please. So what I opted to do is to provide you 3 levels of maps that resulted from the virtual course. So this map, so the first map I showed you had a fairly accurate representation of the actual geology that was on the ground. This map is the next best approximation A couple things to note: there's not any structural references that are included in this. There are bedding surfaces that just end for no apparent reason, but the overall geometry of the structure is starting to be reproduced, and the general units. And I go back to the fact that the students knew exactly where all these units were from the videos. And so a lot of that information was something that they were given and didn't have to determine on their own. Next slide, please. The cross section that follows. And you could see that this cross section is very simplistic. And this is where, as a structural geologist, I'm feeling very remorseful that we didn't have a chance to work with the student in the field while we were working in the mapping area to try to get them to see some of the geometries. So the cross section here is similar to that one I showed from the first virtual class or student that didn't appreciate the angular nature of the geometry of the Highway 2 area. Next slide, please. And this is a third example of what students could have created based on the information that they were given. And so you could see some good information here where they were appreciative of the fact that there was a topographic expression that needed to be reproduced in terms of the geometry of the contacts. But in terms of the overall geology, one does not recognize this as something that has an angular set of folds and faults that are reflected on the topography of the map area. And then the cross section for this is similarly appropriate in terms of the geometry of the folds and some of these faults, but it loses the sort of understanding of the kind of geology that's represented in the Highway 2 area. And so these three examples of the kinds of products that result from the virtual classroom or the virtual coursework really emphasize the fact that not being in the field is a potential detriment for the average student, that where we can't work with them in the field. And then the other problem, and Maddie did a good job of talking about the help sessions and other things, but there's nothing like being in the field with the students with their maps and standing there and pointing out features that they could see so that they could begin to adjust what they're seeing in real time in the field based on the observations they could make. So that to me was the biggest detriment of the virtual field course, was that we couldn't give the students feedback in a timely fashion so that they would then not be able to appreciate how their initial concepts and their initial observations needed to be modified to actually end up with a solution closer to what was actually on the ground. With that, I'll just close.
Okay, Mike Riegel here, and Paige, have you granted me control?
Yes, you have control now.
Excellent, thank you. And so my part of this is just to talk about some of the things that we might be able to use in the future to improve our teaching at the traditional field camp. And as I think you've probably seen, what happened in the summer of 2020 was not a faithful recreation of what the traditional field camp is, but rather we all sat down and brainstormed about the best way that we could possibly share the most important lessons that one learns at the field camp if we have to deliver it virtually. It's what we had to do. And in reflecting on it now in the months after the virtual course, as was the case with my traditional courses, the pandemic taught me that, there are some things that I cannot do as well virtually, but there are other things that I can actually do better in a virtual kind of sense. And, what went into this course? I mean, it was a team effort through and through, but really the only way that we got through this was to divvy up the different tasks and have people focus on different things. You kind of had Jim and his field crew out in the field, filming videos, coordinating what was going on there. Jim and the field crew would pass that off. Paige and I were the primary developers, and we then passed it off to Bruce and the AIs, who were the kind of proofreaders, the troubleshooters, and did the majority of the actual synchronous teaching and feedback. And when you kind of do the math on this, I know I put about 400 development hours into teaching this course. I would guess that there was somewhere in the order of between maybe 2,000, 2,200 hours put into developing this virtual content. And I think, if we could salvage some of this and redeploy it or use it in different ways or to augment our teaching, great. That it'd be nice to know that we can get some more life out of that. So, when I didn't bounce this off of Paige or Jim or Bruce or anybody. I'm just kind of trying this out for the first time myself now. But I suppose when I think about it, undergraduate preparation has really changed in the last couple decades. And, I think compared to, where students might have been, say, 20 or 30 years ago, they're somewhat less prepared for the kinds of things that they might encounter in a geology field camp. And so, back when I was a student there, the caravan trip was used as a chance to really get a sense of the regional context. The first time I had ever been west of Ohio was when I was a student in 429. And, for me, that caravan trip was awesome. It was the first time I'd ever been in the West, and the first time I'd ever seen the Rockies and the stuff that I heard about in classes. It was my chance to get that regional context, but also to get people refreshed on the fundamentals. But because we had to deliver it virtually, we had to think about what would work and what wouldn't work in this mode of delivery. So instead of the caravan, as Paige said, in that first week, we chose to focus on more explicit instruction on the fundamentals. So typical caravan trip for, it's oftentimes review. But it's become clear to me that for an ever greater percentage of the students that take it, it might be the first time they're doing some of this stuff. And so because we had explicit instruction on the fundamentals in a way that was delivered to them on their screen, they could see, they could ask questions and know that every question will get answered. They didn't have to worry about asking a question in front of the group. They could work at their own pace. They could replay some of these videos. I think that this was a good opportunity to really make sure that truly everybody had a good understanding of the fundamentals. And just one example of something that we did in the virtual class that we might not do in the face-to-face course. But this is a Google Earth image of an area in the Black Hills. It's about 2 miles away from where we stop and see the pegmatite by Mount Rushmore. So we start with a Google Earth image, which is something that's familiar to most of these students. And we can really, in this case, I think, give them a better sense of what goes into making a geologic map. As you can see, there's scattered rocks here and there, and a road and a sense of scale. And this is the kind of thing that we could actually go to this place when we're back in the field. But you can say to the students, look, this is where we're starting from. You see that outcrop, you see that road, you see that densely forested area. In this course, we're going to teach you how to take that and turn that into a geologic map. And I'm just pausing here for a second because it's not advancing. Paige, I might ask you to advance for me. Can you click ahead one slide to the geologic map overlay, please? Thank you. So you can take the students, you can give them the understanding that by the end of this class, you're going to take something like, this forested area and those few outcrops, and you're going to be able to turn it into a geologic map like you see here. And then we can start to do some things that might be a little bit abstract to them. Like, look at the strike and dip symbols that somebody else has recorded. Which way are the beds dipping? Oh, and do you see that those beds are also V-ing in a downstream direction? Go ahead and advance, Paige. So that even if you didn't have a, and go ahead and advance again to the topographic map. So that even if you didn't have the strike and dip information from somebody else, but you know where these 3 units are cropping out, we can do this thing called a 3-point problem and really work them through the basics. Paige, go ahead and hit advance 2 more times, please. So that this is a case where each student can have in great detail instruction delivered to them in a way that they can see, in a way that they can replay, and in a way that they can get as much feedback as they need. I could see a case where this sort of instruction, perhaps before the course begins, for maybe some that wish to get caught up, or maybe after they've already been there, where this kind of thing augments some of the field-based work that they do. Go ahead and advance the next slide, Paige. Another thing that we did, because we couldn't be in the field, say, for example, on the caravan trip, we had to use the tools that we had at our disposal. And so we chose to give the students in the second week a sense of the regional geology using published geologic maps. And 2 things that I think are important to note here. Thing 1, many of you as undergraduates may have used those, they're often referred to as the folio maps. It's basically a series of geologic maps that were really widely used and distributed for teaching purposes that were accompanied by a book of questions that really were fantastic resources for learning how to teach with geologic maps. So that was the kind of inspiration for teaching with published geologic maps. But what we did was take advantage of the fact that in the last 10 years, there have been a huge number of geologic maps published in the northwestern part of the United States in the areas that we go to. These maps are published at a scale of 1 to 24,000. They have fully kind of annotated legends. They're available digitally, and they are very similar in style and detail to what we're going to expect our students to produce at the end of this course. So this was a chance to get them to examine other maps, to learn about the finer points. You know, this is a normal fault. This is how we know it's a normal fault. This is how we symbolize a normal fault. And oh, by the way, if you don't believe what's on the map, you can look at these other things to also demonstrate that that's in fact how it works. So we're really giving them very explicit, we're showing them in great detail what published geologic maps look like, what you can get out of it. And then after we guide them through it, we're giving them quizzes that are testing their knowledge about what's already out there. And so given that for many of them, this is the first time they've ever done anything like this, I think that there's an opportunity here to improve our teaching by really explicitly focusing on the basics. Go ahead and advance to the next one, Paige. And it's not just nitty gritty about, is this a normal fault or is this a reverse fault? But rather, again, here we're using published geologic maps and cross sections. We're giving them a chance in the spirit of the old folio maps to really start to interpret them, to think about bigger picture things, like diving into reconstructing the geologic history of an area, focusing on relative age relationships, exposing them to stylistic conventions and portrayals of things, so that when they start making their own maps and cross sections, they have a better sense of what is going to be expected of them and what one can do with a good geologic map. And go ahead and advance to the next slide, Paige. I think another takeaway for me is that, you know, there's a tension out there between teaching the fundamentals as they've always been taught versus, you know, what the students often gravitate towards, which is new or digital or flashy kinds of technologies. And I think I speak for all of the faculty when I say that we would all agree that it's most important to master the basic concepts. And if you understand the basic principles and have a good framework for what you're doing, it's then really easy to pick up new tools that they can integrate into their workflow and speed it up. But if you start with a kind of flashy gizmo that shows you how to do things and you don't understand what's going on behind the scenes, you could be in big trouble later on. And I think, a good example of this is we often struggle in the age of Google Earth and cell phones. We often struggle to get students to understand the value in a paper map, the value in being able to read a topographic map and interpret a topographic map. And so, they're often like, well, I know where I am on my phone. But, what we did in this class was to give the students in Google Earth an exact overlay of the paper geologic map that we were going to ask them to complete. And so, yeah, go ahead and advance one slide, Paige. We could do things like toggle back and forth between imagery and topographic maps, just as we do in the field. But the technology has matured to the point that we're no longer struggling with things like differences in scale, differences in extent, et cetera. Go ahead and advance one more time, Paige. And in the virtual class, we had no choice but to give them points in terms of where they were. I could see a scenario in the field where we were using this kind of unified data set where we're getting, they're starting off with paper products that are the same size, the same scale, the same extent, et cetera. Things that they can then go back later on at night and examine in 3 dimensions. But do things like, okay, guys, where do you think you are on the map? And while we're there with them, make sure that they put their pencil on that map and say, I am here. Well, now, something that we could consider doing is double checking that. Okay, so by the way, we know from a GPS unit or a phone that we are right here right now. That's great. And what it does, it allows us to raise the bar in other ways. So we're not dealing with slop. We don't necessarily have to deal with slop associated with imprecise location anymore. Fine, we'll get dialed in on the map, but now we can do things with the students like, okay, you're here. You're standing on this ridge, which is the base of the phosphoria. Draw me a line on that map that shows me how the base of the phosphoria extends laterally. Show me what happens to it when it goes over that ridge or through that valley. And I think now, when we're back in the field, if the students often think, I'll just walk it and I'll take a bunch of data points and I'll map it out that way. Well, this is a case where they're standing there, they realize they'd have to hike a half mile up that really steep hill if they wanted to take the approach that in theory seems real great, or they could just demonstrate their mastery of topographic map reading and draw the line on the map from where they are instead of spending 2 hours walking uphill. So I think that, if we combine the traditional and new technology, now that that technology has matured to the point that I think it's finally useful, I think we could probably have the best of both worlds. And something else that I would mention here that Jim may touch on is, this, as I said, this is not a duplication of the traditional experience, but it shows us that some of the most important lessons of 429 can in fact be conveyed in this virtual way. And so for those students who say can't do a field camp, cannot physically do it, or don't feel safe doing it, or whatever it might be, those students who might be put off by taking a field camp, there's an opportunity here for them to learn those lessons, even if they themselves cannot go to the field and do it. And so, Paige, you'll have to advance through a couple Zooms that are just going to show the fact that these days we can, even in Google Earth, pick out individual trees, individual outcrops, all those sorts of good things. And just go ahead and advance to the next slide for Jim.
Okay, so for some reason I can't share my video, but hopefully everybody can hear me. First of all, if you know Bruce and me, we always have to go back and forth on some things. So one thing that Bruce said that I just want to correct is that we did not give the students any formation names in the field video work or the rock descriptions in the field or the sketch maps that we provided to them. All the field video work described the rocks, and it was the hardest thing for me to do, to describe the rocks without saying this is the Morrison Formation. But we never told the students what the formation was. We made them interpret the formation based on the rock descriptions. So one of the things I wanted to talk about is how academic diversity is, as many of you probably know, one of the greatest strengths of the field station. We all went to school, or we all went to the field station and took the 429 with students from schools all over the country, sometimes other countries. And so it's that learning from each other that's very, very important, as well as learning from the faculty. And one of the things I wanted to do for you very quickly is compare 2019, our last face-to-face course, with 2020, our virtual course. And you can see we had about 10 more students in the last face-to-face course in 2019. The best students were equally good in the face-to-face course and the virtual course. And we gave out 9 A's or A minuses in both those courses. And in the 2019 face-to-face, we gave out those 9 A's or A minuses came from 7 different universities. In the 2020 course, they came from 8 different universities. So when we're talking about the very best of the students, I think we had comparable statistics, both face-to-face and virtual. Where it really becomes an issue is with the average student or the below average student. So you can see that in 2019, in the face-to-face course, the average grade was a B. In 2020, the average grade was a B minus. And if I were quite honest, I'd say we probably curved a lot of those students up to a B minus instead of giving them a C plus. And then the more important thing was in the virtual course, we had a much higher failure to complete ratio. We had more students who wanted to drop the course. We had more students that ghosted us and just disappeared, and we never heard anything from them again. That is very typical of any virtual course, but it's also very disturbing to our faculty because we never want to have a student that doesn't complete the course. So overall, for the really good students or the better than average students, I think the virtual course works quite well. Maybe not so much for the average and below average students. Next slide, page. So what I want to do now is shift to the field station. Since we didn't have students at the field station this summer, we were able to get a lot of work done. So we put new siding and roofs on the 2 formerly called Amish dorms. And we've renamed them in honor of Sue McDonald and Jim Brophy, who both taught at the field station in previous years. We cleaned up about 2 acres worth of construction debris and trash on the north end of the campus, east of the South Boulder River. And when we did that, we also removed a lot of trees that had been killed by the 2019 Good Friday wildfire that Joel Dagenstein can tell you a lot about. We've initiated a renovation project on the upper bathhouse. That's the main women's bathhouse. And the importance of this renovation project is that we're going to be able to remodel the upper bathhouse and turn it into a really nice modern facility for about 1/5 the cost of replacing it. And we can do it not only cheaper, but we don't have to go through a lot of the complicated IU architectural approvals because it's basically a maintenance project. It's not a building project. And so we're going to be able to have a nice new women's bathroom facility for a lot less money, and it'll update it and make it a place that people don't look at and say yuck. The other thing we're doing is the smaller men's bathroom on the west end of that building. We're turning it into a handicapped accessible bathroom, and we're making it flexible bathroom space. So if we need a single-use bathroom, that'll be our single-use bathroom. If we need more men's room space, it'll be a men's room. If we need more women's room space, it'll be an additional women's restroom, as opposed to just being locked in as the old school men's room. And then we've done some smaller things like replacing the windowsills in the dice lodge. Next slide, page. So these nice beaming, shiny, bright, galvanized buildings are the dorms formerly known as the Amish dorms. And so they're now named after Sue McDonald and Jim Brophy, and they sit as the northernmost two of our student housing buildings. And that's I think that's Anderson in the background there, but they're at the north end of the housing area. Next slide. I guess we're waiting on this slide, too many pixels or something. But what you'll see in the next slide is a purple outline around the area that we've cleaned up. You can see the old dump truck piles and the trash piles. This was 70 years worth of accumulation of junk up on the north end of the field station. And then you see a lot of trees along that lower right purple line, that's the fence line. Almost all the trees that you see inside that purple boundary burned in the 2019 Good Friday wildfire. So all that's been cleaned up. Next slide, page. And we now have in this area that purple boundary that we'll see in the next slide in a photo looking west. We now have an area that provides more recreational space. You see that dirt berm that's just in front of the trees looking towards the South Boulder, towards the west. That dirt berm is about 6 feet high, about 40 feet wide, and about 100 yards long. And we're referring to that as our upper camping area. So that'll be tent camping for students or visitors who want to pitch a tent instead of sleeping in a dorm. Off to the far right side of this picture, up next to the South Boulder, there's a nice level area that if anybody has an RV and they want to bring in and dry camp in their RV, they can just drive right in there. And then all this grassy area that's in front of us, between us and the berm, is new recreational space that we'll have for the students to use. So we added about 2 acres of new space. Next slide, page. I can't actually remember what the next slide, there it is. Okay, so 2021, we plan to offer our normal 429 6 credit 6-week course. Last year, we made the decision to offer a shortened version of that we call 428. That's the first 5 weeks without the concentration. And that's to provide a lower cost opportunity for students who don't need 6 credits. By moving the concentration to the last week, it allows us to open the concentrations up to students who maybe took field camp at another university or took field camp with us in a previous year, and they want to explore a new, different concentration than they took. So that core face-to-face course program is going to look the same as it historically has. We're cutting down the virtual class to 4 credits, 4 weeks. And if IU approves it, we'll be offering it from May 10th to June 4th. It'll, as you saw in the description of the virtual class this year, it won't be a perfect replication of the in the field face-to-face field camp, but it can teach a lot of students a lot of the lessons that they would learn in the field. And this is really designed for the students who can't take a rigorous field course for one reason or another. Maybe physically they're not able to do it, maybe for health or reasons they're not able to do it. Maybe they're scared to go in the field, so scared that they just can't function well in the field. or maybe they're working single parents and they don't have a way to take a 4 to 6 week course out in Montana because they have to take care of their children and they have to go to their job. So this course, we think it'll be approved. We haven't got approval yet. We got approval from the college, but we're waiting on university level approvals right now. But we're hopeful we'll get to teach it. For the face-to-face courses next summer, we will have to work in a COVID-19 world. We've got a whole set of special COVID-19 health and safety procedures. And in 2021, the course will be designed so that we minimize the interaction between our landowners and the local community, which is generally older, and our younger student population, because the risks are different. And so we're reconfiguring. The first week will be fundamental skills, kind of like the virtual course was, but it'll be taught at the field station. And then we'll go on a shorter caravan trip to Yellowstone and the Bighorn Basin, the Bighorn Uplift, the Owl Creeks, and some of those things that we've traditionally done on the first week caravan of 429. Next slide, Paige. So in conclusion, we think we had a very successful summer. We got pretty positive feedback from the students, and some of the feedback that Maddie didn't mention was that we've had students tell us that given the situation of not being able to go in the field, they think we did the best possible job anybody could have done. I'm sure we had some other students that didn't really feel that way. We took advantage of the summer to do a lot of work at the field station. I showed you pictures of that. And we've got our 2021 plans in place with COVID-19 related modifications. We've also made one other slight modification for 2021. Our scholarships have historically been focused on reducing non-resident costs because IU tuition was higher for non-residents than for residents, and focused on academic merit. We're still going to keep those as two of our biggest criteria, but we're also adding in a financial need criteria. So in the future, students who can present a viable case for why they could not afford to come to our course without some kind of financial support will get additional financial aid beyond what they would have gotten simply because of their academic merit. Now, we're not lowering our academic standards, so they're still going to have to meet the minimum academic standards to get into the course, but we are, for the first time, really going to start considering financial need as a scholarship criteria.
Jim, if I could interject, we also were able to nominate a number of students from the virtual course into the NAGT USGS program for summer internships. So that's another positive.
Yeah, so in that way, it's exactly the same as the face-to-face course. You know, we got, I think, Bruce, we got the same number of students that we would have had nominations for if it had been the face-to-face course. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. So with that, I think all of us are done talking. I want to thank you for joining us. If you need to leave now, that's okay, but we'll be here and we'll be happy to answer questions. Barb Tillotson is going to facilitate the questions, and then if you let us know what you want to see, Paige can pop the slides back up and you can see different portions of the course. If you have specific questions you want to ask one of us, you know, just tell Barb in the Q&A section, this question's for Bruce or for Maddie or for Sarah or Paige, whatever. And now this is your time to ask us questions. So Barb, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I tried to separate some of the questions by based on who was speaking. So hopefully I can help direct them to the right person. First of all, we had a couple questions on this being recorded, and will it be available for the alumni to look at this presentation later on?
The answer
So,
to that is yes.
okay. Bruce had shown an example of some of the students' work that showed up, but a question came up, and I think it's for Paige. Can you play one of the traverse stop videos so that people can see exactly what the students saw when referencing these stop videos?
I'd be more than happy to. We can show Jim off.
Oh, this is
Okay,
going to go
I'm going to
really
share my
badly.
screen then. So I had students, I set them up to try to, sorry, it's going to the PowerPoint. I had the students set up at the beginning of the course telling them to count how many pairs of shoes Jim has. So like it was a competition. Ends up Jim didn't have his shoes showing in any of them, but it was, you know, trying to recreate that kind of feeling of being in the field, you know, kind of, you know, we do the little games and stuff. And I don't have one of you, Jim. I'll show Will right here. I mean, I do have lots of you, but the one that's coming up. I don't know if you guys can hear that.
Yeah, the sound's not really coming across. I can talk over this a little bit. And
Okay, let me try turning it up.
Well, let's do that.
Okay, that sounds good then. Okay, turn the sound off, Jim, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, what we tried to do in each of these videos was go to an outcrop just like we would have in the field, and then describe the rocks. So we describe bedding thickness, we describe lithology, we describe color, we describe bedding thickness. We had the ability to have hand lens photos, and we took photos of hand samples, and those were added on to the video. But basically, Will or Cass or myself, and occasionally Jess King, would just sit there at the video and describe everything like we would have in the field. And then we'd take a strike and dip, or take a trend and plunge of a fold axis, or take a parting lineation trend and plunge, whatever was the appropriate material that we would have done in the field.
Great. Thank you, Jim. A couple of alumni have asked if they can get a complimentary access to the virtual course so they can re-experience their time at IUGFS. Is that a possibility?
It's a possibility. We're going to have to figure out how to do it. So we'll probably just have to, you'll have to contact, probably best to contact me. And then I can invite you to be a guest at to the course website. I got to double check and make sure that works for everybody now that the course is over.
Jim, one option is we could translate just some of the the mapping exercises over to a separate course page, and then it could be one that's active now, and then add people.
Yeah, we'll figure out how to make it work, because the current page is still active. I didn't know that for a while. Bruce had to educate me, but it is still active. So I think I can still invite people, or Paige or Mike can still invite people to that site, but we'll need to test it out. So if you'll send a note to me, you can give my email address there on the Earth and Atmospheric Sciences website. If you'll send an email to me, then I'll try and get you set up as a guest.
Okay, thank you. This question might be for Mike or Bruce. Have you considered using Esri ArcGIS as a component of the virtual field camp?
You want me to do that one, Bruce?
Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Okay, and if you have, I'll hand it off if you've got anything to add or that you disagree with. So a lot of this, although we were using Google Earth as a way to deliver a lot of the imagery and topographic maps, all of this was built in ArcMap. and then simply exported to Google Earth format. And the reason for that was, I think that we were already pushing them as hard as we could push them with geologic concepts, and that if they didn't, adding more layers of technology, I fear would have gotten in the way with the mastery of the basics. However, I do think that one way that potentially ArcGIS, or any of the Esri products could be kind of rolled into this. A natural place for that could be as a kind of add-on at the end with the specialization, for example, because you'd then have a group of people that were self-selecting because they were either tech savvy or wanted to be. And then the concentration would be focusing on the technology aspect of it. So in my mind, that might be the most natural place to do that. But please do realize, yeah, Esri products made all of this possible. So what do you think, Bruce? Does that do it?
I'll throw a couple other things in there, Mike. The Esri products are more expensive than using Google Earth, and we were trying to keep this as low cost as possible for the students. So we can each get access to Esri, but like Mike said, it was used to build some of the products that were actually lighter weight and easier to use for the students. And then to follow on Mike's comment about the concentration, one of the future plans for the course is to offer a concentration in digital mapping technologies, where we would definitely be working with Esri and probably tablets in the field, instead of working on paper in the field. But we only want to do that after the students have demonstrated their mastery of working on paper in the field.
Thank you.
If I could also interject that some of the products that are available might need to come from other sources than what is directly through the field station, but they would be complementary. So that would relate to things like some of the concentrations and the terrestrial laser scanning and things like that.
Thanks. I have a couple questions that I think are geared towards Maddie. Here's two. One, how much time was spent each day on the course? And in student feedback, was there a tabulation of pros and cons of the course that the students provided?
Okay, thanks for that question. So in terms of number of hours that they spent, I put up a little plot in one of my slides, but it seemed like most of the students spent between 5 and 7 hours per day. And that included going to some of our regularly scheduled lectures, if they wanted to show up to the Q&A session, and just their time spent working on their assignments, which we think is pretty similar to the thinking time, working time that they would have in the field. Of course, they weren't hiking between stops, so that cuts the time down a little bit. And in terms of pros and cons, we left that kind of as an open-ended question. So I didn't have a little table there, but a lot of students were basically just appreciative of our efforts and the time that we put in, and just how well we were able to put this together in a short time.
Okay, thank you.
Can I hop in there really quickly and just say that we also had a much more diverse student body than we typically see, which was really great to see. And we also had a lot of working parents that wouldn't necessarily be able to get away. So we had a pretty, it made it more accessible to people, I think, which was really nice.
That's great. That's great. And Sarah, while I have you there, there was a question to see if you could reiterate what Slack is. I don't think everyone understood that.
Yep. So Slack is just it's kind of like a text messaging service, but it's a message board where you post a message, everyone else can see the information, and you can have it on your phone or on a computer or something like that. And you can directly message people or just post a comment. And so it was just a quick way for us to communicate rather than email or some cumbersome website.
Yeah, I like that idea of making it very informal so that the students can talk to each other and almost have a conversation like they would if they were at the site. So I liked that. That was really cool. Jim or Bruce or anyone, what did other field camps do? Do you have any statistics on how many were canceled versus how many were virtual?
So I don't have statistics, but Bruce and myself and a few others on the faculty participated in an NAGT CERC effort around creating virtual field courses, not necessarily just field camps, but virtual field courses. It started right around mid-March, and it's still going a little bit today. I would say that the biggest shock to me was that a large number of US schools actually teach field camp in Europe, in the Alps and in the Pyrenees and places like that. So all of those were canceled. And so we were getting calls, starting mid-March, we were getting calls of, could you take our students? Because our camp in Europe was canceled. And so there was a lot of effort by a lot of schools that teach camps here in the US to kind of come up with virtual alternatives. I know of 3 schools that actually went ahead and taught face-to-face courses, but only for students from their university, not for students from other universities. And I know of about 20 courses that went virtual, but the range of the virtual courses went all the way from ours, which was really focused on trying to make it like you were in the field as much as possible, to other courses that I would have just called a remote sensing course, where they did everything in Google Earth or in Esri ArcGIS, and they never actually even had a rock description to look at. They were just describing the rocks based on what they saw on the satellite images.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree with Jim that there have been a number of field courses, so-called field courses, that were basically remote sensing courses, oftentimes in international locations. And so there was a limited number of options for students that emphasize traditional field courses in the sense that the field station offers.
Yeah, I'd
Okay.
also like to, Barb, if you don't mind, I'll throw one other comment in here. I think that 2020 provided a backlog of students that want to take field camp in 2021, because a large number of students at all the different universities chose to defer until 2021. If they weren't graduating before the end of next summer, most of them chose to defer until 2021. So there's a big backlog for students. But on the flip side of that coin is the really big risk that a lot of field camps are going to go away, because now we've proven that you can have a virtual field camp. And I think a lot of schools are going to start accepting virtual field camps in place of real field camps. And so the next few years are going to be quite interesting as far as field camps go, because some are going to go away because they can be replaced by virtuals, and others are going to feel like they're overcrowded because too many people have deferred.
You know, just to add a comment to that, it'll be interesting to see when it comes to recruiting for industries, how taking a virtual field course to taking an in-person one might influence some ability to find jobs in some industries when you're looking at 2 different resumes where all else being equal. So that'll be interesting to see if that does come into play when people graduate, you know, once they have the option. So there was a quick question about some of the virtual topics, and someone brought or asked if there was a virtual mint bar on Saturday nights. So thought I'd read that one out loud. There was a question about the affiliation and participation with Montana State University. Is that still ongoing?
So it turned out that the alliance with Montana State University, from the point of view of co-teaching, is just not going to work, because theirs is a 3-credit course and ours is a 5 or 6 credit course. And we just couldn't make that mesh together really well. But the alliance is continuing in that Montana State is going to teach their course out of IUGFS. So they will start their course around mid-May and finish at the end of the first week of June or so. And then we'll arrive around the 20th of June.
Great. And so to build on that, and you're still planning on offering the virtual course as a smaller credit one in May every year in the near future?
That's the plan if IU approves it. And there are multiple reasons why, I mentioned, and Mike also mentioned, all the different kinds of students who can't take the face-to-face course for one reason or another. There are some students that fall into some of those categories that we don't want to come to IUGFS. But we don't want to discriminate against them by saying, no, you can't hike up 1,500 vertical feet or you can't do 10 miles a day in rugged terrain or something like that. We don't want to discriminate against those students. And so by offering the virtual option and with IU Student Services helping us direct students to the best course, it actually expands our ability to give courses to students.
I think that's a great idea. It sounds like IU is going to be a leader in that. I think that's great. There were 2 questions about alumni participation. One is a couple people commented about not having expertise in some of the modern technologies and mapping of using Google Earth, draping tops, or other digital geologic data. Would there be any interest or plans to create a course for alumni to help them modernize their mapping toolbox?
Yeah, we definitely consider that. I mean, it's kind of a demand issue. If it's one alumnus or alumna, then I'm going to point them to Mike Riegel and let him do a virtual Zoom session with them to teach them how to do it. If we have a dozen or 2 dozen people who'd be interested in that, it's easy for us to put together a little course.
I'll have them send emails to you. And also, is there an opportunity for alumni to spend time at the field station to either help students or just be there for a brief amount of time?
So in 2021, probably not. So what we're going to do in 2021 is really try and minimize the flow of people in and out of the field station. All the students are going to go to Montana. They're going to arrive at the field station. The first couple weeks, they're going to be at the field station. It's basically a group quarantine. If anybody gets sick, we're going to have infirmaries set up, a men's infirmary, a women's infirmary. We'll have a nurse on call if we need for taking care of people who are sick. And we're hoping after that first 2 weeks that any illnesses have kind of gone through the system and we're stable. So we don't want a lot of new people coming in and potentially bringing something. We don't want our students going out to the 2-bit on Saturday night and actually contracting something. So for 2021, it's going to be a reasonably closed campus.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. How many IU students attended this year? Took the course?
Bruce, was it 4 IU students in the virtual course? Did I lose Bruce?
I believe it was about 4, yes.
Okay.
I guess I would overprint on that I think we had about 10 or 12 IU students signed up before we had to go virtual, and most of them deferred until 2021.
Yeah. Yeah, we had about 5 or 6 that took the course, and a couple did very well and actually got nominated for an NAGT USGS scholarship internship.
And then I kind of had one question to add is if I don't know how much time we have, but if you could kind of, or any of you or all of you, list the top 2 strengths and weaknesses of the virtual or of X429. Bruce, we'll start with you since I see your face up.
Yeah, the biggest weakness is that the students did not have to make their own personal decisions, that they were presented with outcrops and locations, and we did the best we could to present them with priorities and things like that. But someone that was good with digital technology could use all the outcrops that were available. And so to me, it was the decision making on the student basis, whether you, do you climb up that hill to see that outcrop or do you not? And so that to me really made a big difference in terms, and the fact that we couldn't interact with the students on a daily basis in the field to give them input. So those are the 2 things that I think were the biggest detriments to the virtual.
What about one of the biggest strengths? What about a strength?
This, to be honest, I didn't see any strengths because they were given a Google Earth image. They were given positions on a GPS location. And so they were not having to operate the same level as we traditionally have in the field course. But that may be that it's a negative, that they should be able to use those things in the modern society or the modern technology. And so, but I'm old. I will admit I am old school.
I think
I'd like to, sorry.
Go ahead.
Go ahead,
I'd
Paige.
like to give some positives because there are some things that I think this virtual format does well. And that is that it allows us to kind of break things down into focusing on specific tasks and specific skills. So when we're thinking about mapping, yeah, I have been out in the field with students who that first week at Doherty can't even keep up with me. They can't even like get to the outcrop in time to hear. I mean, I'm fast. I'm almost as fast as Bruce, but they can't keep up. And so they miss out on the content of like, how do they actually put these things on a map and how do they think about what they're translating from field observations into to their map. Because they're so worried about all the physical demands. And I mean, that first week is supposed to be getting them up to speed in terms of both the mapping and the physical demands. But the good thing about the virtual course is that it allows them just to focus on the skills of mapping. And so how do you take the observations, which, Jim and the AIs gave them in the field, and translate them into things on a map? And so, yes, it's not the same as mapping, but I would think that because they're out there, they're doing this and they're just practicing the mapping part, when they then go out in the field for the first time, they're going to be more capable of taking that stuff and actually getting past, just focusing on the physical stuff and using the skills that they learned through this virtual course to be better mappers in the future. Yes, a virtual mapping exercise cannot replicate the field exercise, but it can break down the component parts and get them to practice those things and then be better mappers when they actually go out in the field. So I think there are positives to it.
Yeah, I think there's another positive in that the material can be revisited numerous times. So, if a student watched the how do you make a cross-section video and then they made a cross-section in Highway 2, and then a couple of weeks later when they're in the final study area, they couldn't remember all the details of the cross-section video, they can go back and watch that video again and revisit how to do that skill that Paige was talking about. We spend a lot of time at the field station in the evenings going through the same material over and over and over again. And by having these skills videos that the students could watch, it'll free up more time for us in the face-to-face course to actually interact with the students in different ways than repeating the same thing over and over about how do you make a cross section.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's good. Excuse me, what was that?
Do you mind if I?
Oh, go for it. Yeah, go for it.
Okay, ready? So I'll start with weaknesses. I would say in my mind, the single biggest weakness is there's nothing like being in the field for getting a sense of the scale and complexity of the natural world. That does not come across in Google Earth. And I would also say, like, you know, students could get from this course as much as they wanted to. And like, this is the case nationally, right? A student signs up for this course, which is virtual, which in our mind is, you know, there's these opportunities for synchronous participation. You can ask questions real time, et cetera. There's a subset of students that think it's going to be an asynchronous online class that they can do in 2 hours a day, right? And that's really been the struggle that higher education's been dealing with. Strengths, I would say, I think, to me, I see a path forward now, especially like moving forward, to balance the utility of the old ways with the advantages of technology. You know, that business about, okay, you know where you are, but I need you to show me you can read a topographic map by drawing that contact, zinging off the right way. I think the access to all is super important. You know, that single parent who couldn't get away to do this now has a chance to get some of the most important lessons from 429, and the explicit instruction in geologic maps is also, I think, a pretty nice layer. So those are my strengths and weaknesses.
Great. Thank you. I think that might be it on time. So I'm going to wrap it up. I just want to thank all of you professors and AIs on behalf of all of the alumni and going the extra miles to create this course in such a short amount of time and putting in all of that extra effort. It was really noticeable, and we really appreciate it and are glad that it's part of the IU field course. Yeah, thank you guys. And I hope we can continue to modify it, and hope to hear about all the great things that happen next year with it. So thank you guys very much.
Yeah, well, thank you, Barb, and thank you to everybody who attended. And if you have any questions, feel free to drop me an email and just let me know your questions. Or if you have any comments that you don't want to share in a group format, you know, you can drop me comments or give me a call and shout at me over the phone or whatever you want to do. So.
Great. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Stay safe.